Hello everybody and welcome back to our Unreal Engine 4 and Playfab series. Now before we get started I just want to say that I've had a couple of months off due to personal reasons, but I hope now that I can come back in and start to create more videos for the sort of things that you guys want to see. Something that I've had a lot of requests about is actually about player characters being different to the players themselves. So if you go into Playfab and then into your players list, and then hopefully if you've got like a dev person like yourself, then load up them in order to just view this. Now under this characters tab here, currently we have nothing. You can't initially set up anything for characters because characters is more of like an optional thing rather than a base thing. So like, like other things in the game like inventory or virtual currency, you can set them up within Playfab. Characters have to actually be done from within the game themselves at the time that they are needed. So what I mean by this is if you take something like World of Warcraft, for example, when you first start the game, you have to pick a character which has like a race and the type of character that they're going to play. And then once the character selects these, this is then what the player, when you go into the player selection list, like your character selection, you have all of the different characters that you have created. This is similar to that. This is where all of those characters and all of their data, that belongs to that character will be stored. So what we're going to do today, hopefully, is go through the way of setting up characters, the way of setting them up both on the title side of things. So when you load up the game, you have different characters to select from. And then once the player has selected a character, hopefully then being able to save it into the player's character list in this section here. And then you'll be able to see all the data that then belongs to that character, and hopefully then just get a list of it in order to display to the character a way of them selecting the character that they have, that they want to play with, or the list of characters that they have an option to play as. So hopefully that's what we're going to go over today, so let's jump straight in. So then I believe the best place for us to start is actually looking at how character selection is done in games. So if we take something like World of Warcraft, for example, first load up the game, or any time that you want to create a new character, you have a list of different types of characters that the player can select from. So again, World of Warcraft, for example, you have different classes such as tank, healer, and DPS. They have different races and they have different alliances. So obviously the main thing that we're going to look at here is just the different classes themselves. We're not going to look too much into the, different alliances or different races and all that sort of stuff, but just the different classes, looking more into things that are more roguelike, where you get to select what character you're basically going to play. And the way that the best way to do that is probably to set up a title data that the game can read from. Therefore, you can control all the base stats of the player so that no matter how many times they start a game over, it always has the same base stats. And then you can read all the information in order to display that to the player through the game straight from Playfab itself. So the best way in order to do that is probably go into content and then into title data, and then you can see here that I've already made one called characters. And then we're just going to jump into here. If you don't have the JSON button there, whenever you create a new key, just put 0 in, or any key, and then the JSON button should open. So if we have a look inside of here, what I've done here is make a simple JSON that contains different values. So it's basically like a nested JSON where you can have like arrays within it or different types of value. So inside of here, we've got something called a tank, which is the key, and then the value of that tank is all of the information inside of here, which contains other keys and values. So then when you're inside the engine or through Cloud Script, you find the tank key, and then you can see all the information that's inside of it. And then the same with the healer. So if you just want to copy that down, that's the basics example. I've only put 2 in here, tank and healer, so that we can differentiate them later down the line, either through UI or just through logs, just to make sure that we're reading them correctly. And then also as well, this will be the base values that we set up our character from when the player has selected what they want to play. Now, in order to get this and get the data that you want, you need to use both Cloud Script and Unreal. Now, the reason that you use both of them, specifically in Unreal, is because Unreal, with its blueprint, doesn't exactly have some of the needed things, needed like calls or code for the JSONs to basically get them back from a string back into like data objects. So it's a lot easier to do some of the stuff within CloudScript that already has that, and then just return the values that you need straight into the engine. So what I mean by this is if we now go to our automation and CloudScript like we've done in other videos, you can see here that I have got a function pre-made called getBaseCharacters. I've already done most of this stuff in testing purposes, and we're just basically going to go through it because in some of the other videos we've already gone over the basics of things like logs and getting keys and all that sort of stuff. So we're just going to go through this now. I have got the title data, so basically the data that we've just set, and then whilst you're making new functions, you know, log. That's all I can say. Make sure you log. Make sure that you're printing out the data that you need to get. So I'm logging the characters here to make sure it works, and I'm logging the data from inside of it. And I'm setting up the data that's within the title data. So this basically gets the actual data itself. It's not split into a key and a value. This is the value of the title data. I'm then passing the data. Now this is the part that you can't do from within Unreal. You have to do this, unless obviously you can download plugins in order to do it, but I wanted to keep it as almost vanilla Unreal as much as possible and use CloudScript wherever I can. So I'm passing the data here, and what parsing does is basically turn it from a string back into the data that you can use. I'm then logging this parse data to make sure that it's actually worked, and here I'm passing through the tank, so it logs the information of the tank, so all the values that we set, so the type, the health, and the damage, and it logs that as all one giant key. I'm then setting the var here. Like this stuff here is mainly just logging the information to make sure that it works. So then I'm getting the parse data of the tank as a variable and then logging it to make sure that it returns the type of it so that you can see that it's going through each step. So it's first off getting the title data, then it's finding the specific one called tank, and then within the tank it's finding the type key and then returning the value of that. And if all of this works, then obviously, it's finding the data that you need. So then we can look at returning the value. So here I just set up a var options with the curly bracket, so basically going to return keys and values. And then because I've set it up in such a way that you can do a for loop for it, I'm basically going through all the parse data, so that JSON.parse data that we set up here. I'm going through this, and every time that it finds it, I'm first off logging what I is. Now I is going to be the key, so it's going to be tank, healer, whatever you set up the initial key as. Might be better if I have the content open in a separate one. So I will always be here, so this will be the tank and the healer. And then if you log the information of the parse data with the I, it will log all of this. And then what I'm doing then is setting up each one basically into its own JSON setup sort of thing, so like a key and a value that then we can return to the player through options. This is what will be returned into the Unreal call that we are going to get the information through, and this will only return these. It will basically return this in like a JSON, so that then within Unreal we can literally say get field type and it will return tank. And it's just a lot easier to handle, but then obviously as well, it's already split up into what the type is. So then if we go into Unreal, we'll be able to see it. But obviously this I here isn't a number, it is a name. So instead of options 0, like in an array, and then it being the parse data that we're passing through, it's options tank equals parse data, options healer equals parse data. Therefore, it's always a lot easier to read it. So if I was to then jump into the player just in order to test this, because obviously you should always test your cloud scripts before you start calling them within the engine, unless it's specific to the engine, like as in you have to call it through the game in order to get it and you're passing through information. If it's just getting information like it is here, the best thing to do is literally just go to a player, go to yourself, don't start calling things through other players, just in case you do something wrong. and then call the function and then run the script, and you can see here all the stuff that we logged. So here you can see that we are passing through all of the data that we're returning. So you can see here we're returning tank and the data, and healer and the data, and then all the logs, so that we can see that all of it's working. Obviously these bottom ones here are from the for loop, and these ones here are mainly just the ones to make sure that we can call each part correctly. So then if we were to now jump over to the engine, we can see how we're going to split this data up once we have it from the cloud script. So we're just going to jump over to our game instance. And then again, I've already set up the function because I had to do testing in order to make sure this worked properly, because I didn't want to spend hours doing something that didn't work. So I created a custom event, as we've done before, read characters, and then it executes the cloud script get base characters. We obviously set up our fail event with our failed function to print any logs that might happen if something goes wrong. And then we also have the read characters success. Now, off of the results, we're going to break that up and get the function results. This is what is returned here, and this is what we need. So then, once we got this, I just encode the JSON. This is basically just putting it to a giant string and then printing it to make sure that it is returning what we think it's going to be returning. It's basically just a good way to make sure that, you know, it's not null or not, you know, it is valid. It is a valid string. Get the field names, and this will basically get the field names of the classes, so tank and healer. And obviously, because that's an object, we can then, because obviously it contains multiple keys, we can then get the field names of all of them keys and print them as well. Obviously, each step I'm printing strings to make sure that you can see that it's working. But basically, it will get the entire JSON and print that. It will get the field name of the classes and print them. It will get the field of each class, because obviously we're putting it in a for each loop, and it will get them as an object because it contains multiple JSON keys. It will get each of the field names of the JSON keys, which is the type, health, and damage. And then it returns, or rather, I've only set it to print string of the key names. But if we wanted to do the value of it, then all we'd need to do is hook it up into here like so, and then do as string, and then do another print string here. And what this will basically do then, it should, in theory, if this works, do the key, so type, and then this one would be tank. So it basically just read through these. So it'd go type, tank, health, 500. And all I'm doing here is splitting it down into print strings so that you guys can see this working. Once you have this working, and as we'll probably, I'm probably going to set up a very basic thing before I record this next clip. But basically, if you wanted to have a UI, you could just pass through this as object JSON value. And then for each one, so for each class, you could then set up a UI that passes through the data. And then within each bit of the UI, it would then read all of the field names. So it'd get the type, the health, and the damage. And then you can select from it. So in a minute, I'm going to show you that. But first off, I'm just going to show you it working on the game itself. So if we just launch the game as a standalone, I'll obviously save any progress you've made. Make sure, again, I shouldn't have to tell you guys by this point, but make sure that you have Steam running, because otherwise it's not going to work. Make sure that you have all the backend set up. It's a great thing to see the initial tab coming up for Steam here, which shows that it's connected to Steam. And obviously these are all the logs that we had before from our past tutorials showing us different things. But all we're going to do now is use a function that I made within player controller. And all it does is on C of the keyboard, or any key you want to use, it calls the game instance and uses the function that we've created here, the read characters. So if we just run this again, just to make sure that it's working, you should see that it will, when we press C, once it's connected to Playfab and done all the other stuff. So just going to wait for it. There we go, you can see all the other logs. If we now press C, you can see all this information be dumped out. And what it's basically doing here is, this is the serialization of the string. So this is just the whole data printed as a giant string. And then you can see that we start to go through each one. So it goes through each class. So tank of the class, and then it gets it as an object. It goes through each of the field names. So type tank, health 500, damage 20, and then it then goes the loop again and does healer, type healer, health 250, damage 10. And these are all the values that we set up within Playfab. So we can see that this is now working, and then once we go to the character creation side of things and actually get the call through Playfab, because it will be calling the data straight from within CloudScript within Playfab itself, it doesn't matter if someone somehow manages to get into here and change these values. Obviously, they're not going to change from this when we just set in it, but once we start to call it up into UI, somebody could, someone could develop a program that goes in and changes these values, which, they might change this to 5,000 rather than 500, but it doesn't matter too much when we initially set up the character, because I'm going to show you it doing it through the CloudScript, just because it's a lot easier of the method to do it through the server, which is obviously through CloudScript rather than the client side of things. So once we get to that part, I'll show you that it will read it straight from the title data, and we won't have to worry about this number or any of the other numbers being changed. But as you can see already, it's reading the title data correctly. So this is the first part of our character creation. The title data is set up, and you have a way to give player to the game of characters that the player can choose from. So I'm now just going to create a very simple UI for us to be able to show this data and for us to click on in order to call the functions needed inside of Playfab to give that player to give the character to the player. And then once we've got the character, once we can actually, select that character, I can show you all the other functions that Playfab offers us within the game, well, within Unreal. So if we go to character, you can see here that we do have an awful lot of functions that we can call. Obviously, you're going to want to stay clear of the admin stuff because you're not really going to worry about that from within the game. The client stuff is okay, but the stuff that I'm going to look at, because I'm probably going to be doing most of this from within Playfab CloudScript, is the server side of stuff. So you can see here that we can get and update character data. We can get leaderboards because characters can have their own leaderboards and statistics. This is the function that we'll use in order to grant the character to the user rather than an item. Basically, the server just can give the character to a player, whereas the client side of it needs an item in order to do so. We'll quickly touch on that shortly, but then if you can see here, we can give characters virtual currency, we can give them inventory, we can move items between characters and character to users, and again, subtract virtual currency. So these are the things that I'm going to show you how to do once we have our character set up, which should mean then you should understand the basics of how characters work within a game from both the game and Playfab side of things. So once I have the basic UI working, I'll get back to you. See you in a bit. Welcome back, everyone. I've managed to get a little bit of UI working. So we're just going to go through that now. So I have created a simple UI that is 200 by 200, and all it does is have type, health, and damage in. So that's the simple values there for that. Then inside of the main menu UI that we've used to display all of our other text and like basically the debug stuff in the game, I've just created a simple character box, which is a horizontal box. And then I've created an event within that is literally just add characters. It creates this widget, the character option, adds it to the horizontal box. I have a function inside, well, an event inside here, which is called update data. That gets called and it passes through the data JSON object from the add characters to the data, and then just does some size and padding so that crap. Inside of the update, all it does is grab the field type, health, and damage, get it as a string, and set it as a text. That's it. And then all I've got here is on click for the button. So when you click down on this, all it'll do is say character selected and then whatever the type was, just so that we know that it is working between the two of them. So that's the simple UI. Inside of the controller, I simply set up a main menu ref inside of the game instance and just set that. And then whenever you call this read characters function that I showed you just a minute ago, on this section here where you get the like the key of the tank, so all the information belonging to the tank and have it as an object, this is where we call the add characters function and pass through the data. So it basically goes add characters, which calls the event inside the main menu, main UI. It creates the option widget, adds it to the box on the screen, and then calls update and then sets the data. So if you have all of that set up correctly, which shouldn't be too hard for most of you guys, I don't think. I've also just quickly enabled the mouse because I realised I never had it on before, so I've just enabled the mouse just in order to click on the button in order to show you guys. But once all of that is then set up, if you then click play and then load up the game, hopefully we should see this updating working fine. So obviously the camera's a bit janked because now I've got the mouse cursor working. There we go, it's connecting to Playfab. If I now click C, there we go, you can see all of the logs that we had before, but our two UI pieces have been added. We've got Tank with a health of 500 and damage as 20, and Healer with health of 250 and damage as 10. And now if I was to click on one of these, you can see here, character selected Tank and character selected Healer. So this is working. We are now at a point where we can click on one of these and call a cloud script in order to give the player the character they want to play as. So that's what we're going to go through next. Just another quick note, all I did at the end of the for each loop where you went through each of the types of characters you can play as is just set it to be visible, because by default I set the character box inside of the main UI here to be collapsed. You know, most of the time if you're playing something like an RPG, when they load into the game, you're probably going to have these set up automatically, or they're going to be called by other events. Just because this is literally called by the C button on your keyboard, I just made sure that it was invisible to start off with, and then only when you pressed it and the function ran correctly, i.e. you're connected to Playfab, it then sets it to visible. You guys obviously will have a much better setup for this, but this was literally one that I knocked together in about 5 minutes. So if we now go over to the option of each one, and we have the type here, so it's basically saying character selected and then the type that you have. This is there where we're going to then put some of the calls that we're going to make to Playfab. So we're just going to create a custom event and call create character. We're going to have an execute cloud script again. Obviously I have yet to create the cloud script, so right now this is going to do nothing and I'm not going to function. However, we are going to need to pass through some data because we're selecting a certain character and we need to tell Playfab what character that is. So, as we have done in the past, you want to create JSON object, set the JSON object variable, set a string field, and then pass that through. And then this is where you're going to hook up what type of character you want the player to basically be given and what they have selected. So obviously we're probably going to call the field name character type, or you can just call it type or something, and the string value we're going to have to pass through here. So we're just going to put this as type. Now obviously if you were creating this properly, you'd probably set up this as an enum and have like a list of characters they can choose from, but again I'm setting this up very quickly in order to show you guys, because this is a dummy project and you know I ain't going to spend all the time creating basic events like that really in order to go nowhere. So I'm just going to set up the failure event. So what did we call this event? It was create character, so create character fail, and then obviously hook up the fail function that we've got just to make sure that it logs anything. Create character success, and then this obviously is going to call the cloud script. Now you could probably put events off of this, so once the character has been created by the game, this is probably then where you'd start to load the game, because it, you know, if this is called successfully and you have, I don't know, a return within the function that's true that it's been created successfully and you can read it and verify it through Playfab, then you know, then you can start to load up the game. However, here I'm probably not going to do that given the fact that it has nothing to load into. We're just going to make sure that it does actually set everything basically within Playfab. So in order to do that, we're basically just going to make sure that the call happens and then everything else will happen inside of Playfab. So I'm just going to give this a basic function name that will copy over to Playfab Cloud Scripts anyway, and I'll just put create character. Something like that, you know, really simple, and that will be the function that we're going to call. So now everything else is pretty much going to be on Cloud Script. So let's get over to our cloud script and start creating the function that we need. So we called this create character, and obviously put in all the other stuff that we normally have. So the function with the args and context. I'm pretty sure I've put that in wrong. Then create our function area. And there we go. This is where we're going to be putting all of the data that we are basically going to be giving the character to give the player. Now, if you have certain things that you want to pass through on creation of the character, this is where you would do it, because obviously this is where all the default settings are set. It also makes sense if you had anything like a base currency, a player or a character rather. This is where you'd set it up and you'd give them that base currency, anything like that. Now the reason that I'm using cloud script is because as I said, it's run on the server API calls, and because it's run by the server it has a little bit more validation to it, but also because when you call the create character for player or give character to user calls through client, you have to give it a item. Basically it's like a way of, in some games you can have an item in order to create a character for the player sort of thing, because obviously it doesn't have to be an actual full-on character. It can be like something else that you use just the character side of things for. So whenever you create an item, there should be is token for character creation. Now this needs to be set if you plan on using this. However, because we're doing the calls through the cloud script, which obviously I'd recommend, we're not going to need this. But if you were going to do this, you'd need to make sure that you give the item that you're setting up the tick here to make sure that it's true, for it is a token for character creation. And then inside the call, you need to reference this item. You need to give it basically the item ID inside the call. So that's what you need to do in order to do the client side. I'm not going to go any further on that because it's a little bit trickier to set up. But what we're going to do is set up the calls within cloud script, which obviously will use the server and it doesn't require the item. So let's get into it. So then I just paused the video in order to create some basic code for us to go over. It's very simple and you guys should automatically be able to tell exactly what it's doing. So we just have two variable types that have been passed through the arguments, character name and character type. For character name, because we forgot to put it in, I've just quickly popped back into the game instance and just created another set field string called character name, and then just hooked up a variable that will pass in through the event, and again just hooked it up to the JSON object. It's just very simple, and you guys should already be able to do this very quickly. So we'll pass in through the name and the type. The type being what your type of character is, so if it's like a tank, a DPS, a healer, that sort of stuff. The name is what the character is going to be called, so think of World of Warcraft. Whenever you click on the character, you then have to give it a name before it can be created. Now, obviously, Playfab doesn't have a unique system set up for unique character names, like straight away. If you guys want that sort of thing, then you guys need to create that system and possibly use some other side things in order, like third-party stuff, in order to check over all the names, or use a server in order to do so. If you just want something basic, like being able to name the character whatever, then Playfab already has that. And I'd probably also put in some sort of profanity thing in order to stop people calling their character names stupid or rude words. After that, all we're doing is logging the name and the type to make sure that they are actually incorrectly being passed through. We just then got the request, and the request is just what goes inside of the server call. So you guys probably already know that, that you can just put them straight into the server call. However, laying them out in a request allows me to show you visually what's actually been set up properly. So we have the player ID, which is obviously the current player ID, the character name, which is the name that we're passing through, and the character type, again, the type that we're passing through. I'm then just logging it in order to make sure that, it is actually being set up correctly. And then we're just using the server.grant character to user. This is what I was talking about before. This is the server call to give the character to the user without using an item in order to create it. So what I mean by this is all we have to do is pass through the name and the type without having to use an item that has the character creation attached to it. This is token for character creation. So if we then just save that, which I've already done, and then quickly pop over to our character, well, our player rather, and then quickly just do the call. Now, obviously, you're going to have to pass through the arguments that we've already set up because it needs them in order to run. So then if we just run the cloud script, you can see that it's run successfully. You can see here that we have the test name and test type, which are just the test name and test type strings that we put in. And then this is the request that it's got, and you can see that it's all set up correctly. So now if we go over to the character screen, you can see here that there is no characters found. If I refresh this now, we now have a character. So you can see here that it's got the test name, it's got its ID and its type. If we go into this, obviously don't click the delete button, we have the ID of it, the name, the type, and the date that it was created. And we also have all of these new things that are available to the character. What I mean by this is a character is basically just a user. It's just a separate entity of it. So we have things like inventory. We can give the character a piece of inventory that is unique to only this character. We can give them objects and policies and files, which I know we haven't touched too much on, but this is something that you guys can do if you need to. We can give them statistics and virtual currency, same as we would for a player. There's also groups as well, so this is really good if you guys want to make sort of like guilds like World of Warcraft has. You can do this, and the characters can join separate guilds for each character they have. And then the title data is probably misnamed. I think it should probably be called character data. But this is basically just all the data, similar to as you would see for the player, that is unique to this character. So we have the standard character data, we have the read-only data, and the internal data. Again, the internal data is only run on the server, so probably be wary with what you put in here. So now that we have all this, we can now start creating our character. So we can start giving them things like health and damage and their type, and if it's this character, because obviously it has the type, character type, that we can get from within the engine, we can obviously then call the correct model that is needed in order to display it, the base model for it, that sort of stuff. So this is where we're going to set up all of the stuff. We're obviously not going to go through crazy amounts of things, but I'm going to show you the basic calls within the engine in order to get and set some of these things, because they are slightly different to the player one, because you have to pass through the character ID. But then once obviously we've done that, then you guys should then be able to go away and create your own characters for your games that you need to. So that's what we're going to do now. So we're just going to jump over to the engine and start looking into some of these calls. Now that we have this working, this basic cloud system, I mean, obviously you could always put something off here. If you were going to use the create character through the UI that we created earlier of clicking on the buttons, this is then where you would then call off successful of the function running and the character being created. This is then where you would then put the game starting, basically, and calling basically the calls to create the character in the game and set up the UI and all that sort of stuff. I'm obviously not going to do that because I have no game in order to do that with, but this is where you would probably do it. So if we just go to some of the events that we can see inside of the calls that we can make, obviously ignore the admin stuff. You can see here that if I go to the server side of things, because you're probably going to want to just create cloud scripts and then call these through cloud scripts anyway, just to be on the safer side, you can get and update the data exactly the same as you would for the player. So this is pretty much exactly the same call. Obviously, if I just quickly drag out these in order to show you the data, you have to pass through the character ID. So instead of just like on normal get data calls where this wouldn't exist, it'd be something else, and you'd have keys and the Playfab ID. This also needs the character ID, so the big long number that belongs to the character. If we go to the overview, it's this ID here. So obviously you can get this through the engine as well. If we do characters, now obviously you can just do this on the client call. You don't need to use the server for this one. But they should have get all user characters. So if we just quickly break this, it just requires the Playfab ID that you guys should already have. And then offer the success. Obviously, I'm not going to hook this up, so it doesn't matter too much that I haven't created them properly. But you can see here that you have an array of the character Jsons. And obviously then you can just go through each of these and get their ID, basically. If you just simply do like encode JSON and then print that, you'll be able to see the key names, or you could go through each key name itself. So you could go through field names, if it should be here. Yep, get field names. You could then go through each one of these and see what's actually there and then get the ID that way. This is probably better for initial setup of the UI. So like when there's a character selection screen of the player's characters that they already have, then this is where you do this sort of stuff, because then you can get the data that's attached to that player already, like their type, their name, the ID, all that sort of stuff, which is great. Once they actually have selected a character to play as, and they start the game, like the game actually begins, you want to save the ID of the character they're currently using, so that then when you use things like get character data or update character data, you pass it through. But also as well, because you're going to be using Cloud Script as well for a lot of things, you're going to need to pass it through like we do here in the set string field to the character, because it doesn't. I don't think Playfab automatically gathers the current character that you're using in the game, because how does it know that? So obviously, if you're going to want to do some of the calls like the update character data, and you need the ID of the character, you're going to have to pass it through as a string field, and then obviously pass in the JSON object to the function for the Cloud Script, so that you actually have reference to the ID. But once you've got the ID of the one that's currently being played, you can basically just do any calls that you want. You've got to think of them as very similar to the player calls. All that's different is that you need the character ID in order to do some other stuff, rather than just the Playfab ID, which obviously is automatically given. So then you can start doing things like leaderboards and statistics. You can get stuff around the leaderboards, as I've shown you in the other leaderboard video that I did a while back. You can use get leaderboards around character and get leaderboard for user characters. It's better if you've got like a big list of characters. If you only have a couple, it's probably going to be a little bit harder to tell if this is working properly. But this will be cool for seeing where the player is in the world rankings or anything like that. Grant character to user we've already used. Update character statistic, exactly the same as you would normally. So it's exactly the same as a standard statistic. However, again, requires the character ID in order to pass it through. Let's just quickly have a look at some more. There's virtual currency and inventory. Obviously, be careful with the virtual currency, because the game isn't going to be able to handle this. You're going to have to do this through Playfab. Obviously, you probably want to do it through a store. So whenever you grant the virtual currency, so whenever they basically buy a virtual currency from the store, so if we quickly go into here, and then, I don't know, we'll just E maybe, or maybe some of the other ones. I don't know if we put anything in that had virtual currency. It's probably a bundle, to be honest. But you should be able to give the character it rather than the player, because this is like just a basic thing that says, what's actually being given and how much. Then when you actually do it and it automatically gives the money to the player, you're going to need to tell it to give it to the character rather than the player, just simply because otherwise it'll give it to the base player. So you just need to make sure that anything you do give like this, if it's unique to characters, goes to the character. So I'd probably set up like a Cloud Script to give currency to character, or give inventory to character, so that it's all hooked up to the correct character rather than the player itself. Because otherwise, then obviously you're going to have a bit of trouble trying to access it, because you're not going to have reference to the player or reference to the character, depending on which one you've done. But after that, then it should be pretty easy, and guys should be able to now start going about creating the characters and giving them data. So I'll leave it there, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.